Science and faith have always seemed to be at odds. But in this episode of the Church Help Desk, Andy Jennings, young adult pastor at Cross Church in Springdale, discusses how science is actually the biggest advocate for the validity of the Christian faith.
Hey, my name's Andy Jennings. I am the young adult pastor at Cross Church in Springdale, up in the northwest corner of the state. So I've been there for coming up on 4 years, and it's certainly been a pleasure. I'm also deeply interested by things like science and apologetics, which is why I've made some friends with some of the people in the sweaters that you've seen walking around here. And this is one of my favorite topics. This is a topic I got into in 10th grade. Just the idea, as I took science classes, wondering how does my faith mesh with science? Why do I see so few TV shows about science that seem to have anything remotely like a Christian perspective on things? And then a deeper question, which I'm going to get to in just a second, began to seep in that I've been dealing with for a long time, and that my guess is if you're college students or even post-college and you took a biology class, a geology class, a chemistry class, a physics class, or anything else in the science building, maybe this question started to occur to you based on the interactions you may have had with professors and the way textbooks work and things like that. But first, I have a more important question that I want to put up there. So, what's special about today? It's Leap Day, right? Do we have any birthdays in here today? Are there any Leap birthdays in here? I thought in a room this big there'd be at least one. Wait, where? There. Stand up. Happy birthday. For the one time in 4 years you get it, happy birthday. On your real birthday. Okay, I didn't miss anybody, did I? All right, cool. Happy birthday to you too if you're one of those people that just doesn't stand up for that kind of thing. Why do we have Leap Day? There's a lot of murmuring. I think years are what? How short are they? They're longer than we think they are, right? A real year is 365 and a quarter days, right? It's actually 0.24 something. But anyway, roughly 365 and a quarter days. What does that mean? What does it mean that it's 365 and a quarter days? What is a year? It's the time it takes the earth to go around the sun, right? And so every 4 years, an extra day pops up because we've been accumulating all of these quarter days every 4 years, and so we add one. Otherwise, I mean, think about it. If just in the last 100 years, our calendar would be shifted by an entire month if we didn't add this day every year. Every century, you'd lose 25 days, and then suddenly summer would be in the middle of winter, and the north and southern hemispheres would switch, where we have winter at different times. So, second question. Yeah, like every week for the last month in Arkansas, winter, fall, summer, spring. Anybody else's sinuses just going nuts? Oh my gosh. Okay, did Christians always believe that the earth revolved around the sun? No, we didn't. In fact, for most of human history, that concept has not really been around, except maybe held by a few people, up until about 500 years ago. So, next question. Do the tenets of Christian faith require that we hold an earth-centered cosmology? Does the Bible tell us the earth is the center of the universe? Up until about 500 years ago, that was the official teaching of the Roman Church, or Roman Catholic Church. And this is the interesting question. This is the interesting question that I want to talk about today. Do the scriptural boundaries of Christian faith require us to reject truths about the observable world? When we think about whether there is a tension or a conflict between faith and science, as we normally think of science, which is looking at the observable world, taking in data, and reasoning to conclusions about it, which is in its most general form, science, right? It just as a very general definition. It's looking at the observable world, taking in data, and reasoning to interpretations of that data about how things function, about where the future is going, how can we forecast weather, and all of that kind of stuff. But this is what would create a tension between faith and science, and this is what culture has been wrestling with for a very long time. Are there things that are true, like really, not the truth that Jim Dennison was talking about, truth as you see it and you sense it, but I mean objectively true things about the world that we as Christians can't actually accept because of our faith? And that can cause a real problem. That is what the scientific community feels toward us, by and large, not as a whole, but by and large. That is what they feel toward us. And we'll get into some specifics of this, but I want to start with this, with a brief history. So, where did this come from? Where did this idea that there was a tension between science and faith begin? Well, it can really only begin when there's something that we would reasonably call science. And the modern scientific movement really didn't begin until, as Jim Dennison said earlier, the time of Descartes. Right? The modern scientific movement really began about that time, what we think of as science. And so the first revolution is the Copernican revolution. Copernicus was the first guy to publish on the idea of heliocentricity, the idea that the earth actually goes around the sun, not the other way around. That's a revolutionary idea in the 16th century and the end of the 15th century, because our common everyday experience says something different. Does your common everyday experience say you're traveling thousands of miles an hour through a vacuum of space? Do you feel that? Does the earth seem to be moving underneath you? Does our everyday experience say that the sun traverses the sky, and from our perspective at least, it is the sun that's moving and not us? That is our everyday experience. Right? And so it is reasonable that people believed for a very long time that that's how it worked, that the earth is stationary and that the sun moved through the sky. And there were all of these systems. I don't have time to really get into what was overthrown when Copernicus published his book. But here's the deal. Just a couple of quick points. The dominant Western worldview that Copernicus's ideas came out of was biblically based. It was biblically based. The dominant worldview that people worked in was that there was a supernatural, that the Bible accurately describes that supernatural, just dominantly speaking, that's what's going on. The debate was whether official biblical interpretation could be informed by scientific ideas. The fight between those who wanted to hold to Copernicus' new ideas and the fight between those people and the church was whether the official church interpretation of the Bible overruled mathematical formulas that made more sense of the observable world. That's the question. That's what they were fighting over. And the most prominent character in the faith-science skirmish was Galileo. If you read Richard Dawkins, if you read Sam Harris and those kinds of guys, they'll always haul out Galileo as this example of a martyr of science who was destroyed by the church because the church so dogmatically held to what was obviously false. And that is a gross misrepresentation. Yes, Galileo actually was silenced by the Catholic Church. Galileo made some pretty poor political decisions that resulted in him being silenced by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church originally allowed him and even encouraged him. The guy who would become the Pope that silenced him was his friend, actually encouraged him to publish on these things as long as he talked about the Copernican system hypothetically. Like, this is a good model for how things work, maybe not how things actually are. And Galileo took his voice, and in his book that described all of this stuff, he took his friend, who became Pope Urban VII, and he put his voice in a character in his book called the Simpleton, who was up against the Copernican philosopher who completely dominated him in the dialogue that Galileo wrote. Is that a politically good move? What happened with Galileo was unfortunate, and I don't think it ought to be repeated necessarily, but it was not the church saying, we don't believe in science, and science has no place where we are. It was a much more nuanced thing that was going on. But this is one of those moments where the idea that there's a conflict between faith and science came out. The second one is the Darwinian revolution. This happened several centuries after the Copernican revolution, and same 3 points about this. Except the dominant Western worldview by the middle of the 19th century, when Darwin is sailing on the Beagle and writing his observations and publishing, was much more splintered. And again, I will defer to Jim Dennison this morning. He explained that really well, that what people believed about reality and about truth and about the supernatural, about whether the Bible was true, whether it could be trusted, all of that had shifted. And especially in Europe, the worldview had shifted to the point where Christianity may have been cultural, but it was very rarely personal. It was very rarely practiced. And that movement has just continued on today, where you have statistics like only 2% of the European population attends any worship service on any given week. So the worldview had begun to shift. The debate in the Darwinian revolution was whether life as we see it today could be explained naturally. And by naturally, I mean entirely naturally, with no supernatural influence whatsoever. Can you find the beginning of life and move to the diversity of life we see today in a purely unguided natural process? That's what Darwin was after. And it came out of his worldview that's revealed in his diaries while he was on the Beagle, that though he studied to be an Anglican clergyman, he had totally walked away from the faith. He totally doubted that God existed, was good, and all of those things, and he was developing a system out of that personal conviction about how the world really worked. And that's where he was making his observations. And the most prominent event, at least in America, there's a play and a movie based on this, was the Scopes monkey trial. The play is Inherit the Wind. And the play is also a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened in this event. But no less than a presidential candidate from the prior political or election cycle was the guy who prosecuted this case. And it was the case of a gym teacher who wanted to teach in a biology class from a textbook that promoted evolutionary ideas, Darwinian evolutionary ideas, which was against the curriculum structure at the time. And so he was brought to trial for various things, and William Jennings Bryan prosecuted him. And actually, he was convicted and fined, and it wasn't a big deal. In Inherit the Wind, the guy's like let off, and the whole town converts to Darwinian evolution. But in the actual event, this was put as this huge debate about whether science would rule the day or faith would rule the day. Would science overcome faith, or would faith overcome science? So those are just two quick revolutions, just a very brief history of why this idea is even there. Why is there an idea that faith and science are in conflict? So on the next one, I want to walk through four people. We're going to do this rather briefly, but four people, some of whom you may know their names, and look at what they're saying when it comes to what must be accepted or rejected. So the first one is Mr. Bill Nye. Bill Nye fans? Bill Nye knowers? Like, I grew up on Bill Nye the Science Guy. That's where I learned about compression and tension and electricity and all that. But he has become a very vocal proponent of what I would call scientism. The idea that true knowledge comes only through science. And that is kind of the thing he's pressing for in his Netflix series. Did y'all watch the debate with Ken Ham a couple of years ago? This is where he's coming from. And I love, it's like Mr. Rogers to me, like growing up. Bill Nye was just this awesome guy, but this is what he thinks, and he's written it down. I continually remind people what's at stake here. And when he means what's at stake is if people reject full-blown neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. Here's what's at stake. Our understanding of evolution came to us by exactly the same method of scientific discovery that led to the printing presses, polio vaccines, and smartphones. Just as mass and motion are fundamental ideas in physics, and the movement of tectonic plates is a fundamental idea of geology, evolution is the fundamental idea in all of life science. Evolution has essential practical applications in agriculture, environmental protection, medicine, and public health. What would the deniers have us do? Ignore all the scientific discoveries that make our technologically driven world possible, things like the ability to rotate crops, pump water, generate electricity, and broadcast baseball. What's at stake in Bill Nye's mind if you reject full-blown neo-Darwinian evolutionary processes is all of science and what we know to be true about the world, that rotating crops makes them grow better because it gives land time to rest. That you can pump water, that electricity is a matter of electrons flowing in a current across an electrical wire or some other conductor. What he's saying is, if you reject the method that brought us to conclude, in his mind, that neo-Darwinian evolutionary processes are a fact of nature, then you have to disregard all the rest. There's a huge problem with that, though. Part of which is crop rotation has been around a lot longer than Darwinian evolutionary theory has been around, like thousands of years longer. It's in the Bible. It's in the Bible to rest your land every 7 years, right? That kind of thing, it's not tied to this. But what he's saying is that if you reject this, what's at stake is the entire methodology by which we come to knowledge through science, if you reject this particular idea. How does that strike you? Does that strike you as a reasonable thing to say? What? A false dilemma, right? If you reject this, you also must reject that. If you accept this, you must also accept that. So, but this is his honest opinion. This is honestly how he views it. And this is why he sees science and faith in tension with one another. That science has to rule the day and faith has to cave to whatever interpretation science comes up with in order to move forward in the world. So, next one. Some of you may know this guy, Alvin Plantinga. If you're in philosophy, you have to know this guy. If you're going to do philosophy, you have to read this guy. I'm convinced he'll be up there with the great philosophers of the modern world. And he's still alive today, so we'll see how that goes. But here's what he says. According to theistic religion, God has created the world and created human beings in his image. It is perfectly possible, however, that he did so by employing, guiding, and directing the processes of genetic variation and natural selection. He may not have, in fact, done it in that fashion. Perhaps you think it rather unlikely that he did it that way. Still, he certainly could have. Of course, there is conflict between the widely accepted idea that natural selection or evolution more generally is unguided. But that claim, though widely accepted, is not part of current science. It is instead a metaphysical or theological add-on, an assumption that in no way enjoys the authority of science. This guy's a Christian philosopher. He's incredibly smart, and he's written a really fat book that'll be at the end under the resources thing called Where the Conflict Really Lies. And what he's doing, because he's an analytical philosopher, he's just going through and saying, is there any logical contradiction between what Christianity teaches and the idea that a guided Darwinian evolutionary process could have brought about the life that we see today? And his conclusion is no, there's no logical contradiction there. Now, there may be biblical reasons for rejecting it, but there's no logical reasons for rejecting it. What he then does is show that there actually are logical reasons. If unguided evolutionary processes are true, there are good reasons for rejecting naturalism, the idea that nature is all there is. And the way he comes about that, I think this is really interesting. The way he comes about that is he says, let's assume that you are the product of unguided evolutionary processes. Is there any end goal in mind then? If it's unguided evolutionary processes, was the evolution of humanity, and particularly your coming into being, does that have a purpose or some goal that it's striving for? Besides perpetuating your genes, no. Right? So, your brain is a product of purely natural evolutionary processes. Should you trust that something that is the product of purely unguided evolutionary processes can reach truth, can reason to truth? His argument is, no, actually, it undermines the entire case of naturalism. What your brain is wired for is survival and reproduction. And if believing something entirely false about the world makes you more fit to survive and reproduce, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if everything you believe doesn't actually correspond to anything in the natural world, as long as it makes you fit to survive and able to reproduce, then it will get passed on, and those ideas will get passed on. And so what he argues is that far from Christianity undermining science, science actually undermines atheism. Science undermines atheism because it removes the grounding by which you can assume your brain is rational and actually reasons to what's true in the world. Are y'all following? That's one of the coolest arguments I've ever seen. that something that Bill Nye says you have to accept in order for the world to function actually undermines the worldview that Bill Nye is putting out there. It actually undermines the very rock he's trying to stand on. And that's what Alvin Plantinga showed, and I just think it's really awesome. But what he's saying here is, look, there's not really a tension between the investigation of how life came about, and even some of the data about how life came about, and Christian faith. The tension is something beyond that. It's something metaphysical or theology, and that is putting answers to the ultimate question, is there anyone behind it? That's not even a scientific question, because it's not based on data, it's not based on observation, it's not based on induction. It is a metaphysical statement. It goes beyond the realm of physics. So again, I just want to kind of walk you through how people see. So then the next one. This is Ronald Numbers, who's a Christian. He's a Christian scientist, not the cult Christian Science. He is a Christian scientist. Here's what he says. Despite the occasional efforts of unbelievers to use scientific naturalism to construct a world without God, it has retained strong Christian support down to the present. And well it might, for as we have seen, scientific naturalism was largely made in Christendom by pious Christians. Although it possesses the potential to erode religious belief, and sometimes did so, it flourished among Christian scientists who believe that God customarily achieved his ends through natural means. And when he says scientific naturalism, what he's talking about is what I'll call later methodological naturalism. And that is the claim that even as a believer, when it comes to doing science, you have to leave God at the door. When you're doing science, you can do nothing but reason to natural means by which things happen, come about, originate, whatever. You can never reason scientifically to a supernatural cause or anything like a supernatural cause. And so in the article I took this from, The Science Without God, he's actually arguing against the idea that intelligent design is science. Do y'all know intelligent design? That movement was really big about 10 years ago. It's kind of fallen by the wayside these days, but it was a movement that tried to show that the best explanation of the data of like where does DNA come from and all that kind of stuff is an intelligent designer. Said nothing about God, nothing about which religion was right, nothing like that. It just said the best explanation for the information replicating process in DNA is intelligence. Intelligence is the only thing we know that can create these kinds of information processes. They do not happen randomly. And he's arguing that's not real science. In fact, he very vehemently and kind of patronizingly discards intelligent design as any kind of reasonable science. But he's a Christian. He's a Christian who's doing science, but what he believes is that when I'm doing science, I leave God at the door, and I only look at natural causes, natural explanations, and natural reasons. That's what he's doing. And then the last one. C. John Collins, in his book, Faith and Science, Friend or Foes, he says it's true, and he's going away from life science to geology, which is another major area of contention about age of the earth and things like that. It's true that modern geology does not depend on Scripture, but this is a far cry from saying that it sets itself in opposition to the Bible. In fact, most of the pioneering geologists in early 19th century England were pious Anglicans. Some were clergy. That should be capitalized. It would only be right to say that geology is opposed to Scripture if we were sure that Scripture requires us to believe that the world is young. And early geologists thought the Bible gave room for other possible interpretations. And so this is a guy, obviously not a young earth creationist, but a Christian doing science who's saying, maybe what we ought to do is allow science to inform our biblical interpretations so that what we're seeing in the world matches up with what we think the Bible says is true. That is exactly what happened in the Copernican revolution. Eventually, official church belief gave way to what became kind of irrefutable evidence. I mean, once we sent the satellites up, it's done. The earth goes around the sun. Biblical interpretation up to that point pointed to passages like Joshua praying that the sun stop in the sky and said, the Bible says the sun stopped. It's the sun that's moving, not the earth. They would point to passages that say that there's four corners of the earth. They would point to passages that talk about the sun moving through the sky. They would say, see, the Bible requires that we have an earth-centered view of the cosmos because that's what the Bible teaches. And eventually people came to understand that's poetry in the Bible. And is poetry supposed to be taken literally? No. And so the interpretation changed as it was informed by what we observed. Where people get nervous is in the question, how far does that go? How far can the biblical interpretation be redone to match up what modern science says they're observing and says are the proper interpretations of what they're observing? That's where conflicts begin to come in. So I just want you to see there's people all over the spectrum, from non-Christian to devoutly Christian, who have very differing ideas about how science and faith can go together. And the question is, well, if they think they're doing science and they're Christian and they don't think it has anything wrong with their faith or it goes in any way against their faith, where is the conflict? Where is the conflict? And this is going back to that original question. Does Christian belief require us to reject any actual truths about the world? And I want to say the answer is no. The answer is no. There is a conflict, though. It's at a level higher than you might think. So let's go to this one. It's not physics. That's not where the conflict is. It's not in doing science that there's a conflict. It's in what worldview do you bring into doing science that causes the conflict. So let's look at this first side, right? It's in answering questions like this, what kinds of questions count as scientific questions? What kind of questions count as scientific questions? That in and of itself is not a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question. It is a question that is meta-science. It's talking about science and where the boundaries of science are. So we can ask this question. Is it a scientific endeavor to ask by what process all mountains could be covered in a global flood and to look for evidence that it happened? Is that a scientific endeavor? What do you think? Is it a scientific endeavor to ask by what process all of the mountains in the world could be covered in a global flood and to look for evidence that it occurred? If you go to the Creation Museum or the Ark Encounter, which I think there's a spring break trip for BCM people going for that, they certainly believe it is. In fact, I went there just a couple of months ago, and they've got all sorts of engineering cool things where they show how, like, waste disposal in the ark and how did all the animals get on the ark and how was air ventilation done and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think it's pretty cool. Whether you believe it or not, like whether you believe that's how Noah did it or whether you believe in a localized flood versus a global flood, that's beside the point. It's just a really cool exhibit. But on the grander scale, we have to ask, is this a question? And there's two things it could be like. One, is that like asking how the earth formed out of a debris ring orbiting the sun, which is the dominant modern scientific idea of how the earth formed. You have a dust and debris ring orbiting the sun, gravity does its thing, things start to clump together, and planets form. That's how earth came about. That is the dominant theory. Can you observe that? Like, do we have a place where we can look through a telescope and see a dust ring forming into planets somewhere else? No. But nevertheless, this is considered a legitimately scientific question. By what processes could a planet form out of a debris ring circling a star? It's a legitimate scientific question according to most modern scientists. Or is our original question more like asking how the dwarfs dug the mines of Moria deep enough to release a Balrog? I mean, that may be interesting to you if you're a Tolkien fanatic. If you don't get the thing there, then you're missing out on one of the best literary creations of the last, 5 centuries. Go read The Lord of the Rings and you'll get it. Right? This is fictional. It's fictional. And in the story, the dwarves dug the mines of Moria deep enough to release this giant devil-looking beast called a Balrog. And you might go, well, how could they withstand the heat and the pressure, and what kind of armor would they have to have on to get down there and all that kind of. You can ask all those questions. Are those scientific questions? No, because there's no such thing as a Balrog. There's no such thing as the mines of Moria. There's no such thing as what Tolkien conceived of as dwarfs. Those don't exist. Is our original question a question about fiction disguising itself as science? Or is it a legitimate question about how something in Earth's history happened? That's where a conflict can come in. Second question. The next one over. What kinds of answers are allowed in science? So if we have a legitimately scientific question like, how did the information storing and self-replicating process of DNA come about? It's a legitimately scientific question, a very, very interesting one in my opinion. Is that something that you can give only a natural explanation to? So that's the next point there. Is that something you can only give a natural explanation to? Or is it something that you could say, possibly intelligence is the source of this DNA process, the self-replicating information storing process? Maybe intelligence is the source. Can you argue that it's a supernatural source? Where does the boundary lie? This is where conflicts come in, right? And certainly within the last 30 years, the first and the second points there have been a huge issue of contention. There's been books and books and books written about it. Just Google like Michael Behe, William Dembski, all those guys who are the giants of the intelligent design movement, and they're going to be arguing that true science looks for the best explanation wherever it is. The best explanation wherever it is. Whereas their critics were saying, no, there is no divine foot allowed in the door, and if you argue for an intelligence that's not a natural intelligence, then you're arguing for divinity, and that's not science. That's where the tension lies. And note, this all depends not on what science is. This doesn't depend on me gathering data and putting it together and trying to inductively reason to the right thing. This is, what do I believe reality is before I ever start the scientific process? What do I believe is real? And what do I not believe is real? All right, so next point there. That presuppositions count. I want to go through a couple of worldviews that you will encounter, and you can go ahead and put all of them up there. These are a couple of worldviews that you may or may not encounter in your university. And it is useful to know them so that when you hear the language being used, you can go, okay, I think I know where you're coming from when you say these things. And I think I know why you and I are butting heads on what counts as science, what's truth, what theories should I actually believe or not, and whether there's a conflict between my faith and true science. The first one started about 100 years ago. It's called logical positivism. And I don't care if you ever remember that name, or A.J. Ayer, who was one of the bigwigs in that movement. What I want you to think of is what they claim. What they claim is that all metaphysical language is meaningless. God exists is a meaningless statement. Why is it meaningless? Because I can't touch it, smell it, taste it, or hear it, or see it. I can't verify it with my senses. Therefore, it's a meaningless statement. I can't figure out anything regarding its truth or falsehood. It's meaningless. They said the only statements that make any sense, that have any bearing on your life, are statements that are either obviously true, like all bachelors are unmarried, that's true by definition, or things I can verify. You all are sitting in this room. Those lights are very bright, right? It's a very comfortable temperature in here. Things that I can verify with my senses, that's the only thing that makes sense. This philosophical position has been abandoned for a long time. It's actually self-contradictory. Because if you say the only statements that are meaningful are statements that can be verified, that are either true by definition or can be verified by my senses, is that statement true by definition or verifiable by my senses? No. The whole thing was self-contradictory. It undermined its own philosophical position, and so people abandoned it. In the philosophical world, over the last 100 years, it has continued, because it was put out there, it has continued to move down through the academy, through the culture, and into individual lives and individual viewpoints, so that there are a lot of people that they don't know this is what they're holding to, but this is what they're holding to. If I can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, or hear it, then I don't trust it. Only what I can verify is what I trust. So that's one possible position. Another was a position that was kind of coined by Stephen Jay Gould, who was a very famous scientist. He called it non-overlapping magisteria. And what he said is, faith has its place, and its place is in the world of morals and values. Faith can talk into morals and values. Statements of fact, that's the realm of science. Morals and values are subjective. Facts are objective. So morals and values are in this realm of faith. Facts are in this realm of science. And the two have no overlap. Things about facts don't go into the realm of values and morals, and therefore there's no overlap between the two. So you can have faith in science, but faith doesn't inform your science. And you can have faith in spite of science. That doesn't matter, because the two don't actually cover any of the same questions. That's what he claimed. Then you have, like the guy we quoted earlier, methodological naturalism. And that is, you can hold to your faith, and your faith can even inform some things about science and fact and truth. But when it comes to doing the scientific method, you've got to leave God at the door. You can never reason to anything more than a natural explanation for what you're looking at, whatever process you're trying to talk about. And you know what? I'm fine with that when you're making one of these. Right? I don't need God to run my phone battery for me. He does. He's sovereign over everything. But I don't need the scientist who invented my battery to believe in God for it to work. I don't need to have the tenets of Christian faith to understand how electrons move and how the protons and neutrons in the nucleus of an atom work. You don't have to have Christian faith in order to understand those things. And you can hold everything about the Christian faith and everything about what makes my battery work and how atoms work, and there's no conflict whatsoever. It's when science begins to try to answer those questions like origins. Where do we come from? How did the universe come into being? That's where worldviews inform one another. That's where presuppositions come in. Because if the Big Bang is real, is it repeatable? No, we can only look at what we perceive to be its after effects and look at mathematical models of how things work and try to reason backwards to something that we think might have happened. And there may be good reasons for thinking that it happened, like really good reasons for thinking that it happened. But those kinds of questions are right on that boundary between what would be something like working with electrons and something more metaphysical, like, is there purpose in the world? Is there a God who started it all, or did it happen without any supernatural cause? Those are things that fall in that boundary or across the boundary where you can find tension and where background comes in. Then you have these two groups, biologos and reason to believe. And if they were in here, they would just die that I put them together because they are in tension over some things. But generally speaking, they'll agree on this, that science and faith questions can inform one another. Faith can inform science, and science can inform faith. And they would generally agree with this, that scientific answers must be consistent with the Christian faith. Now, on some level, they may modify their Christian faith in order to make it make sense with what they believe is scientifically true. But they believe the two need to be consistent, and so they can inform one another. And by and large, anybody in either of those two camps will believe in the authority of the Bible. Maybe not its inerrancy, but at least its authority. And they will believe in the personal God of the Bible and in Jesus Christ and in salvation by faith, by grace through faith. So they will believe in that kind of thing, but they believe in a dovetailing between what science tells us and what the Bible and our faith inform us about, so that it all is one consistent thing. And then you have answers in Genesis, which I would put on the far right of the spectrum, where they say scientific questions always are subservient to my interpretation of the Bible. Right? And it's in their case specifically, because it's answers in Genesis, it's specifically about Genesis 1 through 11. How does creation work? Was there a global flood? How did Noah and the ark work? How do we get the nations and all of this kind of stuff? If you go to the Ark Encounter, this is what you're going to find. And so what they'll say is the proper interpretation of the Bible is young earth creationism, and therefore all scientific answers have to fall underneath that particular view. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm saying they have a presupposition that informs what they think science really is and isn't. Presuppositions count. And my guess is, if y'all are in the academy, you're running into a lot of people who hold to that first or second position. Either that faith is about what you personally believe and what gives you your values, and that has nothing to do with objective fact in the world, or they'll say it's just pure nonsense. It's just pure nonsense. You ought to abandon it. We've moved past that as a species. We've evolved past that. We understand where religion came from. It doesn't hold any sway anymore. Let's just move on. My guess is you've encountered that. It's important to understand when somebody says that, they are not saying a scientific statement. They're saying a metaphysical statement. They're saying they're stating a presupposition that they're bringing into the endeavor that they're supposed to be doing. And then they're doing science with that presupposition already in place about what can and can't be a right answer, what can and can't be the proper explanation. And you just need to know that because it puts you on an even playing field with them. Everyone has presuppositions. Everyone has a worldview that they bring into what they're doing. Whether it's science or law or ethics or philosophy, you have a worldview you bring into what you're doing. And it informs what you do. So when we're having discussions with people who say, faith either needs to be done away with, people like Christopher Hitchens, faith is a poison, you need to get rid of it. Or you're dealing with your professors who say, it's fine that you're a Christian, but don't bring that into my classroom, it has no place here. Understand that they are not saying something, they don't have the high ground just because they're the professor and because they're a scientist. Now, they are an expert, they have a PhD, so give them that much credit. But when it comes to understanding where they're coming from, it's really important to understand the presuppositions people bring into what they're saying so that you can have fruitful discussions with them about it and not just speak over one another and yell until it's all over. All right, so then on to the next one. How do we move forward? And first of all, am I tracking? Are y'all good? I'm not putting everybody to sleep, I hope. All right, how do we move forward? This is the full-fledged Andy Jennings opinion on these things. So I'll just preface that. We need more Christians doing Christian science. And again, not the denomination Christian science or the cult Christian science. I mean doing science with a Christian worldview. You can go into physics. You can go into cosmology and astronomy. Don't go into astrology. That's not actually a science. You can go into chemistry. You can go into all of these things with a Christian worldview, and there's nothing that you will find to be true that you have to reject. Did you know that? Because all truth is Christian truth. All things that are really true are Christian truth. Because all truth is rooted in God. There is nothing that is true that God doesn't believe. And therefore, there is nothing that is true that you can't believe. The question in this conflict between religion and science is whether these things are actually true. Whether it is an unguided Darwinian process that brought about the species that we see. Whether the Big Bang was a purely natural, non-guided process by which an explosion happened from a singularity and we have everything we have here. Right? All of those things, the question is, are those true? And those are perfectly fun questions to debate. We can have great conversation over that. Because ultimately, whether those were unguided processes is not a scientific question, it's a metaphysical question. So you can sit down with a cup of coffee with somebody who has the totally opposite viewpoint as you, and have a very calm, collected conversation about why you hold to what you hold to and they hold to what they hold to, and see if you can help persuade them of what you actually believe about God and about Jesus and about the gospel. We've got no reason to fear where scientific endeavors may lead us. You do not have to be afraid when you walk into a scientific classroom. You have just as much, in fact, I would argue as a Christian, you have the most grounding for your worldview over and against anybody else's worldview. There are good reasons for holding your worldview as a Christian, and you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to be afraid when you walk into a science classroom that just because this person has a degree and they've been in the field for a really long time, they get to dominate you and you have to soak up everything that they're saying. So don't fear doing science under a biblical worldview, even though that stance is not popular. And it's not, especially in the academy. It is not popular to be a Christian and to try to go into the academy in any kind of scientific endeavor. But you don't have to be afraid of that. The only way we can sway that, the only way we can change the fact that it's not popular, is for you to become scientists and to go into these fields and to begin to be salt and light where you are and to begin to change that culture. That's how we do it. We as Christians can't go, well, since you don't like us, we're just going to insulate ourselves from this. No, we dive headfirst into it because we're confident about what we believe. regardless of what culture thinks about it, regardless about what an academic department thinks about it. We dive headfirst in because we're confident about what we believe. We know why we believe it, and we believe that science is a Christian endeavor just like any other truth-seeking endeavor. So then the next one. We need deep theological training in high school and college groups. Because the world of science is so driven, in fact, the world anywhere, but the world of science in particular here, is so driven by presuppositions, you have to know yours. Why are you a Christian? Why is Christianity a reasonable belief system? Why is it reasonable to believe that 2,000 years ago, something that does not happen happened? That a man walked out of a grave after he died? Why is it reasonable to believe that? What are the encounters with Jesus that you've had that bolster your faith in your life? Take those things with you. But in high school and in college groups, like, you have to be training young people, and college students and high school students, you have to be training yourself. Like, push your pastors on this. Ask them tough questions. Ask your student pastors. I'm giving you license. I'm sorry, student pastors, you get to go study and read books. This is what's going to happen. I need you to push pastors to think about these things. Because if you aren't trained, how can you go and hold your own in this world without fear of being overrun and overwhelmed by the viewpoints of other people? You have to know what you believe. If people who hold to a non-biblical worldview get to be so belligerent about believing their non-biblical worldview, I think we can stand firm too. And we ought to. But you cannot do that if you don't know why you believe what you believe. And if you don't know what you believe, which is the theological part. And then finally, because I don't think we have to be combative all the time. In fact, I think we very rarely ought to be combative. When you go into the sciences, find common ground with the people that are there. If you want to be salt and light in the scientific world, you can't go in going, I'm the Christian and I know all the answers and you need to bow to me. You can't do that. You also can't go in and be just totally silent and say, I'll hold my Christianity right here and try not to let anybody else know that I have this thing. You go in confident because you know what you believe and why you believe it. And then you go, hey, you're into electronics, I'm into electronics. You're into particle physics, I'm into particle physics. Let's talk about particle physics. This is great. You know what's really hard for people to reject is a friendly person who shares their interests. Because you just like being around friendly people who share your interests. So be that. Be a friendly person who shares the interests of non-Christians in the sciences and say, look, I don't see any problem with believing my Christianity and figuring out how circuits work. I don't have any problem with looking into star formation and how a supernova works and holding to my Christian faith. And you can be out there doing this kind of thing. All right, and then this should be the last one. These are just some resources. So you can take a picture of that slide if you want. Here's what I'll say. I put these up there because they're about this debate, not because I endorse everything that's in these books. I endorse most of what's in these books. I like them. Controversy of the Ages was written by one of my professors at Southern Seminary. I think it's really helpful, but it agitates some people because he's saying we shouldn't really fight over the age of the earth. Like, have a view, but don't break fellowship with somebody over that view. And then the book by Alvin Plantinga, Where the Conflict Really Lies, I would suggest if you don't have a mathematical mind that maybe you just read certain chapters of that, because he gets really deep into logic and stuff like that. But it's an awesome book. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn's not a Christian. He wrote this book a long time ago. It's actually what pushed Steve Jobs to do what he did. But this is a foundational book for understanding how major scientific theories are overthrown. Like, how do we go from a Newtonian system to an Einsteinian system? That was not popular in the scientific world, regardless of faith or anything like that. Movement from a system that had been right for 300 years was not an easy thing for Einstein to accomplish. But eventually, there were just so many crises within the old system, they had to move to a new system. But it can also inform you on how you can help people understand the need maybe to move past their naturalism and maybe begin to be open to the idea that God exists and that he works in this world. And then finally, Darwin's Doubt. That's a good book about maybe some of the holes in neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory that can't be explained very well, and it's something that you might find helpful. All right, so that leaves 10 minutes. 10 minutes, which you can take for yourself, or if you have questions, I'm more than happy to chat with y'all for 10 minutes. So I think we got, if y'all want to, does anybody have questions? All right, cool. So, is this on? All right, cool. There you go.
I guess my question is, how would you, what would you say about like the issue with climate change or all the controversy around that?
That's a good question. So, is the climate changing? Yes. I mean, I don't think we can deny that. I also don't think it's anything new. I think the Earth's climate, I mean, if you believe in ice ages and things like that, the Earth's climate has been changing for a long time. The philosophical and metaphysical question is how much are humans contributing to climate change? And I'll just say up front, I don't know enough about the issue to tell you yes or no. I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to look into. Like, how much CO2 are we putting out with our cars and through our factories? There's a giant trash patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's got to be having some kind of impact on something. We can trace certain things and certain patterns, but it's also important to realize that good records of these things only go back about 150 years at most. And so if you hold to modern scientific theory on a 4 billion year old Earth, 150 years of data that's not a statistically reliable sample. So I think more than likely the best answer to that is educate yourself as much as you can on it, realizing unless you go into climate science, there's always going to be a glass ceiling on what it is you actually know. And I think you can take a stance on it. I think you should probably, that we need to not go, there is no such thing as climate change because I'm a conservative Republican, and therefore there is no such thing as climate change. I think we have to be really careful about that. As for whether it's happening, I think there's no doubt that the climate is changing. I think it's an open question how much humans are contributing, whether it's really running off into the hell that they're saying it's going to run off into, and whether it's reversible if that's the case. I'm not an expert enough to say whether that's actually happening. Got one back there. You can just shout it if you want, or you can wait for the mic.
Thank you. My question is, how will you compare all the natural events that are happening in the world right now with what we have in the Bible that they said all the events that God said would happen in the future? For example, in Revelation, where he said a lot of things will be happening in the world, and with the natural events that are happening, for example, earthquake, and a lot of other stuff that when they happen, as Christians, sometimes we explain it, God said those things will happen in the Bible. And with the science view, they can prove those natural events are like natural. So how will you compare those natural events as natural and as things that God said in the Bible that will happen some days?
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, it's when I see something like an earthquake that causes a tidal wave that hits, or a tsunami that hits Japan, shuts down a nuclear reactor, things like that. How do I view that as a purely natural event, or do I view it as something God is doing? Is that, give me a thumbs up if that's...
I mean, I precise in the Bible and Revelation, there's a lot of...
How much does it line up with end time stuff?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's two things I want to say about that, and I'll make sure I stay under time here. First of all, if you go and you read the Old Testament prophets, and you read what they say, so take, it's Amos that talks about the locust plague. Amos or Joel? I think it's Amos that talks about the locust plague. Is it Joel? Okay. Joel talks about a locust plague. A locust plague was something that happened on a fairly regular basis in the ancient world, and you can still see them today. But they were something that happened regularly enough that people were aware of them as events. And you can go, when the natural order of things just culminates with a particular kind of weather, a particular amount of rain, a particular amount of vegetation that is ripe for locust larvae to survive in large numbers, to multiply, or to grow up and to become hoppers and creepers and all of this kind of stuff, and then they just devour everything in sight. You can go, that's a purely natural process, and I don't think that the Bible would say differently. What the prophets do is they come along and say, yes, that's a natural event, but God's doing something through it. And God was behind it sovereignly in order to accomplish something. And so you can look at events in the world and say they're natural, but then our understanding of God's sovereignty is that he's always back there and he may be doing something through it. What I think is illegitimate is to do what Pat Robinson does and to say, I know why God is doing this. It's to punish such and such and such and such because of these sins and those sins. That's speaking for God on a level that I'm just not willing to do. Now, as to the question about how much it lines up with end times prophecies, on some level, I think we're just way more aware of what's happening worldwide because of modern technology. These things have been happening for a long time. And depending on how you interpret the book of Revelation as like a strict narrative chronology or more of a cyclical political statement, that's a different discussion altogether. I don't feel comfortable saying we're seeing a ramp up in these things and therefore we're very close to the end times. I think we're just more aware of what's happening worldwide. And so when a tsunami hits Japan, we hear about it 30 minutes later. Whereas before, you may never have heard about it in America because it wouldn't have made the news across the sea. So on that level, I think part of it is being in our modern environment where we're just inundated with information from across the globe every single second of every day, and things just seem way worse. What I can tell you is, as much as we may dislike our political environment, like we've got it good today. The fights that Republicans and Democrats are having are ideological, not violent, I'm going to drag you out and hang you kind of fights, which have been pretty common throughout human history. And so when we look at persecution and things like that being ramped up, I mean, you're not having your relatives have their head dipped in tar and lit on fire for Nero's dinner parties. You have people say nasty things about you on social media. And we go, persecution, well, there's degrees of it. So anyway, all of that with the natural world and with our political upheaval and everything, I know there is always the hope that we should have that Jesus is coming today. I mean, by golly, I am done with this place, honestly. Like, let's set it all right. I love y'all, and I expect to see y'all in the new heavens and the new earth, but I am done with this place. And I'm ready for Jesus. And I think that's biblical. Like John says at the end, amen, come Lord Jesus. I'm ready for it. I hope for it. And maybe we're close, but I don't think you can look at what's going on in the natural world and say we're definitely like right on the cusp. That's my personal opinion. There are smart people who would disagree with me. Over there, just maybe one or two more. Just stand up and say it. Okay. Right. I think that's probably accurate. The idea that God, so her question is it is a scientific statement to hold to the notion that God created the world 6,000 years ago with the appearance of age, and that's why it looks very old. I mean, he created Adam and Eve as fully mature people. He created animals that were fully mature. Why can't he create a world where light beams that stretch billions of light years were already there, and it didn't take billions of years for that light to travel? And that is a position held by a lot of Christians. I think it's a theological statement more than it's a scientific statement. It's taking an interpretation of the Bible, and I don't think it's illegitimate. I mean, I think there's good theological discussion to be had about that. But I think it is a theological statement that would inform how you would do geological science, how you would do biological science, and things like that. But, I mean, you can't prove that any more than you can prove that I'm a brain in a vat and that this is all an illusion. Right? I mean, you can't prove it one way or the other. It's an interesting theological discussion that brings presuppositions into scientific endeavors, is how I would define that. Is that, okay. All right, one more.
This is always kind of touchy conversations, but I think it plays that, well, we have to be careful. There's a conflict today, and I think the conflict has to do not just with, okay, do we bring a presupposition in to a scientific discussion? Well, where does the authority of Scripture play this?
I think as Christians, it's the norm that norms all norms, right? Norman non normata. It's not normed by anything. The question isn't whether Scripture is the norm. The question is over proper interpretation of Scripture. And I think specifically where this comes to a head is in Genesis 1 through 11. With what is Genesis 1 describing? Is it describing the actual chronological 24-hour creation of the world, or is it giving you a framework for understanding how the world was created? Are the days literal 24-hour days, or can they be interpreted as long stretches of time? And I think those are discussions we can have fruitful, interpretive, theological discussions over.
So that's a good example you bring up. I'll say this, and I don't want to monopolize, but so in Genesis 1 and 2, when you look at the Hebrew word yom, in the context that it's written, because you can take that word and you can make it mean a period of time. It can mean bygone eras, like back in the day, or it can mean a 24-hour day. You know, the Hebrew scholars, you read them now and they'll say that word yom is interpreted literally in the context it's found as God created. The first day was a 24-hour day. The second day was a 24-hour day. So then, if that's what the word really literally reads, where's the debate? Where's the interpretive challenge?
Here's what I'll say. It's something that I've said before, that when really smart, Bible-believing Orthodox people disagree over something. When I would say really smart, I mean, like, there are people who got their PhDs in biblical Hebrew who don't necessarily believe that the word yom there has to be a literal 24-hour day just because it's modified by first, second, or third. There are Hebrew scholars who believe that, and there's Hebrew scholars that believe on the other side. I just get a cup of coffee and talk about it, and I think you can have fruitful theological discussions, because it seems to me there is a legitimate openness in the text there where you can debate both sides. What does not exist anymore, in my opinion, is a mic drop theological moment where you just go, boom, that's the way it is. Where there are smart, Orthodox, Bible-believing Christians who still today disagree over these things. Smart, Bible-believing Orthodox Christians have been writing about theology for 2,000 years. The only questions that are left are the hard ones. The ones where there is a legitimate openness in the text for multiple interpretations, and we're trying to figure out what does the text mean. And ultimately, that's what we're after, right? Because what the text means is what it means, and that's what is the norm on our lives. What does the text mean? Not what do I think it means, not what does it mean to me on this day after eating this burrito and all this kind of stuff. What does it mean? And where the debate exists, I think we as Christians have to have grace and tolerance with one another, to have open discussion without separating and splintering as much as we normally do, and say, you know what? There seems to be a legitimate openness in the interpretation of this text where you can take one view or the other, and let's just keep having the discussion because our goal is truth. Our goal is what does the text mean? But at this point, 2,000 years into the Christian texts, there's really nothing but hard questions left. And so we wrestle with those, and I think we wrestle with them honestly.